Okay, good afternoon, guys. I'm going to talk to you a bit today about Hans-Georg Gadamer, and specifically Part 1, Section 2 of his great work, Truth and Method, section entitled The Ontology of the Work of Art and Its Hermeneutic Significance. I thought about Gadamer for a long time and taught him a fair bit at both the undergraduate and graduate level. Stopped doing that some years ago for various reasons, but I still think that Gadamer's thought remains very unfortunately neglected, especially, or at least certainly in the English-speaking world, the world with which I'm familiar, and in the literary critical, literary theoretical area of that world. I think that Gadamer's philosophy of understanding constitutes an alternative or a lost horizon to some of the ways in which we are accustomed to thinking and talking in the literary academy about the nature of the literary phenomenon itself, the nature of art itself. For me, Gadamer is a thinker with the capacity and the ability radically to transform our understanding of fundamental categories in the humanities, including the categories of history, of language, and of representation. There's a lot of thinkers, theorists, and philosophers and critics who are able to move the dial a little bit in terms of how we think about these categories. In my view, Gadamer is able to turn the dial all the way around and to provide us with ways of thinking about what we do that simply aren't available anywhere else. And that's why I wanted to put a reading from Gadamer into the final portion of our course. I wanted to start just by saying briefly about how I came to Gadamer years ago. I came to Gadamer when I was trying to turn my dissertation work on John Milton into a book. And to give a very short version of the story, my dissertation work on John Milton had come to focus on the topic of interpretation, the phenomenon of interpretation, and on the role of secrecy and discovery within the topic or phenomenon of interpretation itself, and a topic, secrecy or discovery, secrecy and discovery being a dynamic I had come to perceive that was very, very important in Milton's Paradise Lost, but very much associated with Milton's Satan. That troubled me for a long time. When I came to Gadamer, I realized, or I learned from Gadamer, that the way I had been thinking about the activity of interpretation was narrow, was very limiting, and in fact it involved a whole range of unexamined ideas and assumptions. So he exploded my sense of what interpretation fundamentally was, and this is what Gadamer does, I think, again with respect to a whole host of fundamental categories in the history of culture and in the study of culture that we do in the humanities. History, for example, the very idea of history. For Gadamer, history is not something we are alienated from. Rather, history is summed up and, as it were, embodied in our own interpretative subjectivity. Language, for Gadamer, is not some realm of uncertainty consisting in the mere traces of intentions, but is rather the very incarnation of intentions as a living hermeneutic matrix. And the category of art, which we're going to talk about in this lecture and perhaps a couple more. Gadamer is a major theorist of art, in my opinion, and again, a profoundly dreadfully neglected theorist of art, at least in the English-speaking world. And what makes him such a major and, I think, revolutionary theorist of art is that Gadamer takes the view that the art phenomenon is not aesthetic, okay? In fact, he develops, in the first part of Truth and Method, which we're not reading together, he develops a whole intellectual history to the effect that the very idea of the aesthetic emerging in European culture in the 18th century, primarily through the work of Immanuel Kant, had the effect of degrading and obfuscating the understanding that the modern world was able to have and has to this day been able to have about the nature of the art object and our encounter with it. Ultimately, what's at stake in art for Gadamer are epistemic and even genuinely epistemological questions. For Gadamer, if we do not understand the truth of art, I don't mean of a specific artwork, but if we don't have an insight into the true nature of the art phenomenon for Gadamer, we can't have an insight into the nature of truth at all. And we are accordingly, for Gadamer, we are laboring, if we are unable to free ourselves from aesthetic preconceptions about the nature of the art object, we are in effect laboring under severe misconceptions about the very nature and possibility of knowledge. I thought about Gadamer for a long time, taught Gadamer for a long time, then stopped doing that for various reasons. But I still think that he's a really, really big deal. And one of those lost pathways, maybe the lost pathway, that we could really benefit from exploring a bit as we think about the implications and ramifications of what we're calling literary theory. And I want to go on then to talk a bit about why Gadamer has been neglected in the English-speaking world and continues to be neglected. And probably it's getting worse, actually, than it was even when I started thinking about Gadamer almost 20 years ago. Gadamer has been neglected and even misrepresented in the English-speaking world, in the literary academy in particular, for a number of reasons, some of which are valid and interesting, some less so. And I'll begin with a valid reason for the neglect or misunderstanding or even misrepresentation of Gadamer. First, Truth and Method, Gadamer's great work, is steeped in and speaking from the high tradition, let's say, of modern German philosophy, both neo-Kantian and idealist, that is to say, Hegelian, more or less. He's also speaking as an exponent of phenomenology in the school of Heidegger, whose student Gadamer was, and to whom he really remained very devoted. And what that means is that if we're not used to this kind of very learned, very sophisticated, very ponderous discourse of modern German philosophy, we're going to find it a little bit off-putting, frankly, challenging, difficult and hard to follow. There's also this intellectual habit that Gadamer has, and one which is, I think, quite consistent with his thinking about dialogue. It's a habit of what we can maybe call philosophical generosity. Gadamer will characteristically spend a long time in Truth and Method, especially the first part of Truth and Method, which we're not reading most of. He'll spend a long time surveying, giving an account of, walking down the road with views with which he's actually going to disagree, okay? But he doesn't come to the disagreement until the very end. It's like the way a German sentence is constructed, with a verb at the end, right? And Gadamer will typically give such a lengthy and such a generous account of the views that he is not going to agree with that it's easy to fall into the misconception that those actually are his views. So it's a bit misleading, his habit of intellectual generosity in that way. Summing up, Gadamer is difficult, both in terms of the intellectual content and the style of his argument, and that certainly is a valid reason for his being misunderstood and neglected. Another still valid, but perhaps less compelling reason for the neglect of Gadamer is that, as I've already indicated, Gadamer's thought involves some radical rethinking of categories that we think we know. It involves doing without or discarding assumptions or presuppositions that we may feel that we can't discard or do without. And so naturally, or almost by definition, there is a tendency to resist the radical rethinking that Gadamer is asking us to perform. One doesn't like doing that because it's scary to give up on things that we think we need, things that we think we understand. An example of this problem in the reception of Gadamer's thought, and for this example we don't have to go to the English-speaking world, we can just look to the German theorist Jürgen Habermas, who was Gadamer's student and then became one of Gadamer's best-known critics. And they have this disagreement, which is quite wonderful, about, let's say, the relationship of authority to dialogue. So Gadamer is a radical theorist of dialogue. I don't mean politically radical, because Gadamer isn't politically radical. I mean philosophically, hermeneutically radical. He's a radical theorist of dialogue, not as an ethical matter, but again, as an epistemic, epistemological matter. Dialogue, ultimately, in Gadamer's Truth and Method, emerges as the site of understanding and of knowledge. And one of the ideas that Gadamer insists upon when he thinks about dialogue is its primary and holistic nature, by which I basically mean Gadamer will insist that we have to expose ourselves in dialogue, so to speak, if we are to learn from it. And if we are to understand and grasp and benefit from the epistemological significance that he thinks dialogue has. So for Gadamer, there can't be any kind of critical perspective which is presupposed when we enter into dialogue, and which we suppose or which we insist has to be maintained or carried through throughout the dialogue. And I fear that I'm not making very much sense of this particular point, but to be fair to me, it's a very difficult point. There can't be a kind of critical thinking perspective for Gadamer that we take into dialogue in advance and harbor within the dialogue. We can't suppose, for example, that as social or cultural technocrats, we're in charge of dialogue in a way that, so to speak, ordinary people aren't. That critical perspective has to be included in what is exposed within the dialogue itself. Habermas, Gadamer's student, on this point, he says, in effect, that's great, boss. I love everything you're saying about dialogue. Let's just add in some critical perspective and then it will work perfectly. Which Habermas offers as a kind of tweak of Gadamer's thought. But the tweak destroys the thought. He has failed to grasp the nettle of Gadamer's very radical idea. And whether or not that particular example made any sense to you guys, the general point that I'm trying to make, I hope, is intelligible, which again is simply that Gadamer asks us to think in ways that we are not accustomed to thinking in. That's very difficult to do, and I think that is a more regrettable but still valid reason for his thought having been relatively neglected and misunderstood. Now I'll move on to one more reason, which I take to be a rather unfortunate reason for the neglect of Gadamer, and perhaps this would be especially in the English-speaking literary academy. Basically, it's an accident of intellectual history. Truth and Method dates to 1960 in German, but it wasn't translated into English until, I believe, 1976. And then it was translated very, very badly, actually. The original translation of the book is almost useless. So, in fact, it's not until 1989 that you get a usable translation of Truth and Method in English. And what that meant, of course, was that by the time Gadamer appeared on the scene as a kind of continental philosophy theorist in the literary review, you already had the heyday of post-structuralism. You already had cultural wars in and around post-structuralism, Derrida, etc., and people who didn't care for Derrida, for Rorty, for post-structuralism in general, people who didn't care for that stuff looked at Gadamer, and to them he just kind of looked like a German branch plant of deconstruction, which he absolutely is not. People who did really dig Derrida, Foucault, Rorty, etc., they looked at Gadamer and they perceived correctly that he was kind of the antithesis of their agenda. And accordingly, they did their very best to misrepresent and destroy him, destroy his thought in the academy. And that's a very kind of unsavory story. But that did happen. And the effects of that post-structuralist misrepresentation of Gadamer, I think, continue to be felt today, such that in many circles of our business, our literary business, if you mention the name of Gadamer, what you get is a great big kind of eye roll, right? Which I think is very, very unfortunate. And a coda to that point, there's certainly also a political element to the neglect, misrepresentation, misunderstanding of Gadamer. Obviously, most people in literary departments are very much on the left. After all, we've just seen the great Frederick Jameson in 1981, for example, regretfully gesturing toward what he calls the incomplete Chinese experiment with cultural revolution. My goodness. Most literary people are very much on the left. Gadamer is very much not on the left. We can characterize his position as a kind of classical liberal one, I guess we would say. And that's a coda to those less impressive, less compelling reasons for his thought having been marginalized in the English-speaking literary world. Okay, that is all by way of setup to the section of the work that I want to look at, or begin to look at with you guys today, on the ontology of the work of art. And I want to let's start talking about that now. When Gadamer begins this section of the work, giving an account of the ontology of the work of art and its hermeneutic significance, he's already in prior sections of Truth and Method, in part one of Truth and Method, he's already brought to a conclusion a kind of tremendous negative program, okay? By which I mean he has labored very hard to set aside the aesthetic conception of the artistic phenomenon. Gadamer, as I've already mentioned today, Gadamer spends a long time developing an historical account of where the idea of the aesthetic came from, an historical account of what he calls aesthetic consciousness. It's very important to be aware and to keep clear that when Gadamer talks about aesthetic consciousness, that's a kind of swear word in Gadamer, okay? That is absolutely what he is against. And we don't have time to go over that whole part, that preliminary part of Gadamer's argument, but we can just set it up very briefly by noting that in Kant and in, let's say, to use a broad brush, let's say in the whole world of modern epistemology centered on the natural sciences, which derives from and is predicated on Kant. For Kant, it is essential that art please. Okay, that's what art, beautiful art, is supposed to do. It's supposed to please by being beautiful, largely an imitation of nature for Kant. That's very important too. And it's critical in Kant that art, the artistic phenomenon, please without a concept, without there being an idea involved that we have to cognize and process epistemologically in order to arrive at a truth. And the reasons for that in Kant we don't need to get into, but we can simply note the point, I hope, that it's crucial in Kant and in Kantian aesthetics that the art object just be beautiful, that it be there to please you, and that it please without a concept, without cognitive activity getting going. And out of that Kantian position, in Gadamer's account at least, comes the whole history of how the artistic phenomenon has been approached or apprehended in modernity. It has been apprehended aesthetically, which is to say, as a beautiful object that gives pleasure. And for Gadamer, this is a trivializing notion, a degrading notion, a notion that entirely misses the point of the artistic phenomenon. So having concluded that negative part of the work in part 1, section 1 of Truth and Method, in section 2, which we're looking at, Gadamer goes on to give, as it were, the positive side of that account. If we lay aside the notion of the aesthetic, if we identify and try to step beyond aesthetic consciousness, what then is art? That's the question. And at bottom, I guess we could say, the kind of answer that Gadamer is going to give to that question, what is art, is certainly not unprecedented at bottom. It's a version of the kind of answer that we will get in different ways in both Heidegger and Hegel. Basically, Gadamer is going to tell us that at bottom, art is giving us a kind of glimpse into the nature of being. But that rather vague, rather gnomic phenomenology is something Gadamer goes on to work out in remarkable and, I would say, quite startling detail based on a series of, I think, really fundamental and very compelling insights. And Gadamer starts, as do a lot of thinkers, Gadamer starts from the notion of play. And I will read a little bit from the very beginning of our reading on page 102 in the online edition, which is the same as the book I have here. Gadamer titles this subsection, Play as the Clue to Ontological Explanation, and he writes, "For my starting point, I select an idea that has played a major role in aesthetics, the concept of play. I wish to free this concept of the subjective meaning that it has in Kant and Schiller, and that dominates the whole of modern aesthetics and philosophy of man. When we speak of play in reference to the experience of art, this means neither the orientation nor even the state of mind of the creator or of those enjoying the work of art, nor the freedom of a subjectivity engaged in play, but the mode of being of the work of art itself. In analyzing aesthetic consciousness," and Gadamer's here referring back to the prior part of the work, "in analyzing aesthetic consciousness, we recognized that conceiving it as something that confronts an object does not do justice to the real situation. This is why the concept of play is important in my exposition." Note again that Gadamer, when Gadamer refers to aesthetic consciousness, that is precisely the attitude toward the art phenomenon in general, that he is against and that he is moving away from. And he's going to go on and try to show us how we can do that, how we can begin to get beyond aesthetic consciousness in this section. He's beginning from the concept of play, the phenomenon of play, as many thinkers do, as I said, and to that extent we may feel like we're on familiar territory, but we need to be very clear how Gadamer is approaching and conceptualizing the concept of play. Gadamer is not talking about play in the sense of a free play, as we find it in Kant's aesthetics, and also we find it in Derrida. And that was why when we read Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy several weeks ago, I stressed that there was something to pay attention to in the way Derrida was deploying the concept of play. Gadamer is thinking about play in exactly the opposite way from the way Derrida does, and I would argue in a much, much more compelling and even intelligible way than the way Derrida thinks about that concept. Gadamer is theorizing play precisely from the starting point of the game. I'm actually not going to consider whether or not that move that Gadamer makes requires any further justification. I just want to make clear that's the move, okay? Play for Gadamer is precisely and essentially gameplay. And immediately focusing on the phenomenon of the game generates a kind of paradox. And this is a paradox that we will find in other thinkers who have thought about play in the work of the psychologist Jean Piaget, for example. The paradox, of course, is that play is serious. And we see the seriousness of play most clearly, most startlingly, when we see it in the playing of a game. A game has rules. A game is nomothetic to that extent, such that even though we think of play as a departure from the normal life that we have of being involved with laws and norms, what actually happens, of course, when we enter the game world is that we simply enter a world of different laws and norms, the laws and norms of the game. So play is serious in that way, but even more importantly, and this will be the next quote that I want to read, and this is what Gadamer really zeroes in on from the very beginning of this section, the experience that we have of playing a game is serious, is perhaps even quintessentially serious, even though it is, so to speak, just a game. And I'll refer this point to a quote from the bottom of page 102 in our text. And I'll pick this up from the phrase, play has a special relation to what is serious. That's about 5 lines down on the last paragraph on page 102. Gadamer writes, play has a special relation to what is serious. It is not only that the latter gives it its purpose. We play for the sake of recreation, as Aristotle says. More important, play itself contains its own, even sacred, seriousness. Yet in playing, all those purposive relations that determine active and caring existence have not simply disappeared, but are curiously suspended. The player himself knows that play is only play, and that it exists in a world determined by the seriousness of purposes. But he does not know this in such a way that, as a player, he actually intends this relation to seriousness. Play fulfills its purpose only if the player loses himself in play. Seriousness is not merely something that calls us away from play. Rather, seriousness in playing is necessary to make the play wholly play. Someone who doesn't take the game seriously is a spoil sport. The mode of being of play does not allow the player to behave toward play as if toward an object. The player knows very well what play is, and that what he is doing is only a game, but he does not know what exactly he knows in knowing that. Fantastic, tantalizing, and I think brilliant statement that Gadamer makes. Yeah, the player knows, in a sense, that he's only playing a game, but as Gadamer puts it there, the player does not know what he knows in knowing that. And perhaps a simpler way of putting that thought, even though a less philosophically serious and impressive way, is simply to point out that when we are playing a game, if we are to play the game, we are unable to express or act in accordance with the notion that it's only a game. If while playing a game, be it soccer or chess or World of Warcraft or whatever it might be, I fear World of Warcraft may be a bad example. Never mind. If in playing a game we think to ourselves, it's only a game, we lose the ability in and exactly through that thought to play the game. At the same time, we do know that the game is only a game, but there is a complete incommensurability, let's say, between the playing of the game and the notion of the game as a game. We have to commit ourselves to the game if we are to play it. That is to say, as Gadamer does, that the game has its own sacred seriousness. So what Gadamer does from this insight into the nature of play is to recognize that play indicates a bifurcation or a division between, let's say, two modes of being. The mode of the non-playing world, let's say, what Gadamer calls the world of serious purposes, and the world of the game, which is a different world and yet toggled to the normal, serious, non-playing world. And furthermore, if we are to enter the world of the game, and what is so wonderful about this insight that Gadamer has, I think, is that it is in no way mystical or strange at all. It's entirely pragmatic. If we have ever played a game, we recognize that I think that what Gadamer is saying is fundamentally true. If we are to enter the world of the game and play the game and play it well, we have to give ourselves to it fully. We have to enter the game on the game's own terms. And almost right away in this discussion, so we're still just on page 103 of the section I asked you guys to read, almost right away in this discussion, Gadamer kind of races ahead to indicate where this line of thought is going. Where it's going is that the phenomenon of play in Gadamer is going to be the beginning, is going to be the clue for the whole development of the ontology of the work of art. Right, and I'm going to read a little bit more here, again, from carrying on from where I was a moment ago, where Gadamer says, our question concerning the nature of play itself cannot therefore find an answer if we look for it in the player's subjective reflection. We can't understand the nature of play if we think of it as a kind of free and totally undetermined activity to which we bring our subjectivity, put it down for a while, and then take it away again. Instead, we are inquiring into the mode of being of play as such. We have seen that it is not aesthetic consciousness, but the experience, Erfahrung, of art, and thus the question of the mode of being of the work of art that must be the object of our examination. But this was precisely the experience of the work of art that I maintained in opposition to the leveling process of aesthetic consciousness, namely, that the work of art is not an object that stands over against a subject for itself. Instead, the work of art has its true being in the fact that it becomes an experience that changes the person who experiences it. The subject of the experience of art, that which remains and endures, is not the subjectivity of the person who experiences it, but the work itself. And the final portion of that thought, which won't become clear until later in Gadamer's discussion, is that when Gadamer talks about the artwork itself, he means precisely a gestalt, a synthesis, a momentary unity, including the artwork, the spectator, and everything in between. So play is going to become the clue to the nature of the work of art via a very, very important concept in Gadamer, which is the concept of experience. And the text that we have, when Gadamer uses that word experience, it immediately gives us the German word that Gadamer is actually using, which is the word Erfahrung. It so happens there are two words for experience in German. There's this word Erfahrung and another word Erlebnis. But what matters is that these words allow Gadamer to get at a distinction, again a bifurcation, in two ways, or creating two ways, let's say, in which we can fundamentally think about the nature of experience. I mean our experience of the world, of any kind. Is experience something that we cause to happen, something of which we are in control from the perspective of our unitary and sealed and self-identical subjectivity? Is our experience of the world, in the largest sense, determined by or referred to our subjectivity as something that we possess and control? Or is experience rather, or is it rather the case that experience determines by overwhelming our subjectivity? It's that latter vision of the way we can think about the nature of experience that matters for Gadamer's philosophy of the moment of understanding. Playing a game, is what he identifies as the fundamental indication that there is such a version of experience. Experience as something that happens to us rather than something that we make happen. And further, the phenomenon of the game is the evidence, let's say, the clue for Gadamer. That vision of what experience fundamentally is actually decisive, probative, and really correct. When we are playing a game in Gadamer's theory, we are having an experience that presents itself to us as something like the pure form of our engagement with the world. And it's something that we do not control or determine, rather, it's something that determines us and controls us. And as I've said, this insight, this clue in the phenomenon of gameplay is going to become the basis for Gadamer's whole theory of art. For Gadamer, when we have an encounter with the art object of any kind, and if we open ourselves to it, if we do it right, so to speak, and it certainly is a Gadamerian thought that there are right and wrong ways to come to an encounter with the art object. But when we have the kind of encounter with the art object that the art object itself, let's say, is offering to us, we are not having a kind of experience to which we bring our subjectivity, like bringing a child to a paddling pool, dip the child in and take it away again unchanged. No, for Gadamer, we are having an experience that itself takes control of, washes over our subjectivity, right. As I have already quoted, the work of art has its true being in the fact that it becomes an experience that changes the person who experience it. And I'll skip down to the next paragraph here. I'm still just on page 103, where Gadamer writes, the players. So he's back now to the focus on gameplay as such, after having rushed ahead a bit to indicate the connection that is going to be made to the phenomenon of art. He comes back to gameplay as such to write, the players are not the subjects of play. Instead, play merely reaches presentation, Darstellung, through the players. So, what have we got so far? We've got Gadamer giving a brief, but I think truly brilliant and insightful account of the nature of play, the nature of the experience of playing a game, in which the players have to lose themselves in the game itself in order to play the game. Play, accordingly, as Gadamer puts it there, reaches presentation through the players, rather than the players serenely or competently deploying their subjectivity in the game. The play itself, the game itself, reaches presentation through the players. And so we have this remarkable and yet I think entirely pragmatic and intelligible vision of the phenomenon of the game emerging in and through the participation of the players, their subjectivity being subsumed within it. And if it is not subsumed, if their subjectivity is not subsumed within the playing of the game cannot take place at all. You can't play unless you lose yourself in the game in that way. Now, as we've said, this is going to be the clue, the pathway that leads Gadamer into a whole theory of art. And let's go on to the next stage, then, of that pathway. The next stage is given, I think, on page 107, where Gadamer writes, apart from these general determining factors, so he gets a little bit stuck, maybe, in the preceding pages, going over and over the insight that we just have been trying to lay out for the last few minutes. And then he moves on to the next stage, to writing, apart from these general determining factors, it seems to me characteristic of human play that it plays something. That means that the structure of movement to which it submits has a definite quality which the player chooses. First, he expressly separates his playing behavior from his other behavior by wanting to play. But even within his readiness to play, he makes a choice. He chooses this game rather than that. What Gadamer is talking about and what he is trying to show and point out in this section is that play, gameplay, is always to some extent representational. It's always referring to or about something. Sometimes this is very, very clear, as when children play cars or play house or play doctor or whatever. Other times the representational function of gameplay is less immediately evident, and yet it is manifest for all that. It's not very difficult to see, for example, that a game like a tennis match has a representational value which we would be able to trace back to athletic or martial contests of the ancient world or of primitive societies. It's easy to see that when we're watching a football game or another team-based game like that, we're watching a game activity which to some extent is representational of human conflict, representational of war, something like that. So play, gameplay, is always representational. This is the insight that Gadamer is having. Even while, when we remain focused on gameplay, the representational element is there, but it is not primary or determinative for gameplay. This is a very, very, I think, interesting and productive moment in Gadamer's discussion, and we can zero in to the bottom of page 108, where Gadamer writes, in general, however much games are in essence representations, and however much the players represent themselves in them, games are not presented for anyone, i.e. they are not aimed at an audience. Children play for themselves, even when they represent, and not even those games, e.g. sports, that are played before spectators are aimed at them. Indeed, contests are in danger of losing their real play character precisely by becoming shows. It has been a very interesting aspect for me of the current coronavirus crisis, as we've been leading up to this reading in Gadamer. It was very interesting for me when a few weeks ago in this crisis, the various major league sports activities throughout the developed world were still ongoing, but they were being played, quote unquote, behind closed doors. So big league soccer was still being played in Europe, but being played in stadia with no audience. That was a perfect exemplification of part of the point Gadamer is making here. Games can have an audience, and in fact, having an audience seems to be immanent within the phenomenon of the game because it's representational. And yet the game doesn't need an audience in order to be the game. The game is always played for itself rather than for any spectatorship. And that lovely remark he makes about games being always in danger of losing their game-like character if they become shows. We can think, for example, of the whole phenomenon of so-called professional wrestling, which is not really sport, even though it mimics sport, but it's played for an audience, and to that extent it precisely is not really a game, and so on and so forth. That's a lovely, brilliant, I think, extremely productive insight that Gadamer has in this moment of his development of the ontology of the game, leading toward, as we'll see, the ontology of art. And we can try to sum up and clarify what I've been saying for the last few minutes as follows. The game, Gadamer is saying, has a relationship to two elements, a relationship that is immanent within the game and yet cannot reach fulfillment or fruition within the game. The game, first of all, has content of some kind. It is representational. It refers to or mimics or is about something, even if only obliquely or elliptically. That's immanent within the game and yet can't be fulfilled within the game. You would never watch a football game, for example, and feel that you had gained an insight into the D-Day invasions or whatever, even though we can see that a football game, in some sense or at some level, is representational of war. There's a relationship to content, which is immanent, that can't be fulfilled. And at the same time, there's a relationship to spectatorship, to audience, which is immanent in gameplay and yet can't be fulfilled within the game. And the next stage almost writes itself, I guess. Art, Gadamer tells us, is precisely the complete development and fulfillment of these representational tendencies that are immanent in play. As when play becomes a play. Game, in that moment, in that transition, according to Gadamer, completes and fulfills itself ontologically as art. And we can turn on this point to page 113. I think it will be... No, excuse me, it's 110. Section B, where Gadamer writes, I call this change in which human play comes to its true consummation in being art, transformation into structure. Transformation into structure. That's the phrase that we have in Gadamer, in English at least, for the process by which play, along that representational vector, fulfills and completes itself in art. Now, I want to say something brief about that phrase itself, transformation into structure. That's one of the regrettable phrases that we have reading Gadamer in English, because we're dealing basically with an untranslatable German phrase. The German phrase is Verwandlung ins Gebilde. Verwandlung ins Gebilde. Verwandlung means transformation, so that's fine. Gebilde, that's the word that we have big problems with. The translators here, Donald Marshall and Joel Weinsheimer, their German is certainly a heck of a lot better than mine. The best they can come up with is this word structure, which really doesn't capture it. Gebilde is related to the word Bild, which means picture. It's related to the process of Bildung, which in German means a process of becoming learned, becoming cultured, becoming formed as an adult human citizen. Something gebildet is formed or patterned, structured, yes, but the word structure is unfortunately and I think irresolvably misleading because it makes it sound like we're dealing with a kind of structuralism or something like that, and we're really not. So that's really all I can do with that, I'm afraid. I just want you guys to be aware that that phrase transformation into structure should not make us think that Gadamer is turning into Levi-Strauss or something like that. What matters in Gadamer is not any idea of structure in particular. What matters in Gadamer at this point in his work is that process that I've just been talking about for the last little while, by which play, in and through its very nature, Gadamer argues, has to fulfill itself culturally in the phenomenon of art. Now, we're going to come to the end of this portion of what I want to talk about, re Gadamer. And frankly, how long this is going to go on, I don't know. This lecture is going to come to an end in about 5 minutes, and then I'll do another one in a day or two. But I want to try to sum up where we are with this aspect of Gadamer's thought, this section of Gadamer's thought. First of all, the account that Gadamer has given us, it is not meant to be anthropological and certainly shouldn't be taken as anthropological. Gadamer's not trying to say he's not trying to say scientifically or empirically where art has come from in this or that human society or in the totality of human societies. Rather, the account that Gadamer is trying to give us is ontological and epistemological. That is to say, it is an account which is meant to find its place within a philosophy of the nature of being, ontology, and within a philosophy of the nature of knowledge, epistemology. Gadamer is going to try to give an account, a correct account, of, let's say, the nature of the claim that the art object makes upon us, and the unique importance of this claim for Gadamer. The unique importance of the claim that art makes upon us for the possibility of our validly and productively understanding our cognitive engagement with the world, understanding what knowledge fundamentally is and why and how it is grounded. In rounding out this section of his discussion on page 111 to 112, Gadamer to a large extent repeats or recapitulates on this higher level of art the analysis he's already carried forward with respect to play, that is to say, gameplay. So starting from the insight that if we want to make sense of this phenomenon, gameplay, we can't start from a degraded or banal concept of our intact and self-identical subjectivity, which is brought to play like a teddy bear being brought to a pretend tea party, sat down there for a while and then taken away again. Rather, we have to recognize that gameplay has, as one of its defining characteristics, precisely that it renders such a conception of subjectivity incoherent and untenable. And so for the transformed game, which with the fulfilled role of content and audience or viewer or spectator, the reformed or fulfilled game that art is. And by the way, we can note in passing that Gadamer, like both Aristotle and Plato, takes the theater, at least for this part of his discussion, this part of his analysis, as the exemplary or telling form of art. And we can close out this first lecture on Gadamer again with a few quotations, which I'm going to take from page 111. The paragraph that begins in the middle here with the phrase, "It is clear," where Gadamer is talking about what happens in the theater, what happens in a play, as opposed to play. Gadamer writes, "It is clear that to start from subjectivity here is to miss the point. What no longer exists is the players, with the poet or the composer being considered as one of the players. None of them has his own existence for himself, which he retains, so that his acting would mean that he is only acting." And I'll skip down to the next paragraph, where Gadamer writes, "According to all that we have observed concerning the nature of play, this subjective distinction between oneself and the play, implicit in putting up a show, is not the true nature of play. Rather, play itself is a transformation of such a kind that the identity of the player does not continue to exist for anybody. Everybody asks instead, what is supposed to be represented? What is meant?" And finally, the first sentence of the next paragraph, Gadamer writes, "But above all, what no longer exists is the world in which we live as our own." What no longer exists is the world in which we live as our own. A wonderful sentence containing, and this happens a lot in Gadamer, I don't know whether he actually means for this to happen, but containing a lot of resonances with Renaissance art, with Renaissance literature, and with Shakespeare in particular. What no longer exists is the world in which we live as our own. Transformation into structure, Gadamer goes on, is not simply transposition into another world. Certainly the play takes place in another closed world, but inasmuch as it is a structure, it is, so to speak, its own measure, and measures itself by nothing outside it. Thus, the action of a drama, and in this respect it still entirely resembles the religious act, exists as something that rests absolutely within itself. It no longer permits of any comparison with reality as the secret measure of all verisimilitude. It is raised above all such comparisons, and hence also above the question of whether it is all real, because a superior truth speaks from it. And I'll skip down to the last sentence of that paragraph here at the top of page 112, okay? Where Gadamer writes, "The pleasure of drama is the same in both cases. It is the joy of knowledge," and going on. "This gives what we called transformation into structure its full meaning. The transformation is a transformation into the true." And later on this same page, Gadamer makes a similar statement, but I think even more marvelously. He talks about art as the raising up of reality into truth. The raising up of reality into truth. Okay, to wrap up, one of the things that has been a bit frustrating for me for the readings that we have spent time with over the last 12 weeks has been the extent to which aesthetic categories and aesthetic consciousness still controls and determines so many of the thinkers that we have read, from Brooks to Fry to Derrida, even to Jameson. That idea of the aesthetic and art as fundamentally aesthetic, as though that's tautological. The idea of the aesthetic controls and determines them all. It hasn't occurred to any of those thinkers that there is a question to ask there. That question has occurred to Gadamer, and I think that's one of the most important questions ever to have occurred, I think, in the history of modern culture. So what we have achieved so far today, I hope, is just to see clearly that Gadamer is trying to move our conception of what art is and of why we have an encounter with art. He's trying to move that conception totally and decisively and permanently beyond aesthetic categories, so that we see it in an entirely different way and a truer way. That's what Gadamer's trying to do. And I'll close on one last point. Gadamer is, let's say, comfortable talking of truth. As he says so marvelously in that line that I read, art raises up reality into truth. And Gadamer, if we were to do a full kind of analytic workup of Gadamer epistemologically, maybe we would have reasons to raise our eyebrows or even roll our eyes at the ringing statements that Gadamer likes to make about the relationship between art and truth. What he is getting at ultimately, I think, is, again, what he takes to be a datum, a given of experience. The kind of experience that we can have, for example, in the theater, the kind of experience that since ancient times, since Aristotle, has been theorized as anagnorisis, or in English, recognition, that kind of experience of suddenly getting it, suddenly being there completely in the moment of the experience of the play, being outside ourselves and coming back to ourselves with a feeling of sudden and total and irreducible recognition. That moment of getting it, that's, for Gadamer, exemplary of the understanding that can occur to us in the encounter with art, and by that token, it is exemplary for Gadamer of the moment of understanding, the experience of understanding itself. That's what he calls the experience of truth. And again, we might well have some analytic pressure to put on that idea, but I am certainly inclined to think that if there is an experience of truth, it is precisely the experience of getting it, understanding as something that happens to us almost without our knowing how it happens. And I would think in any scenario, whether we're talking about sitting at the theater or trying to understand a mathematical formula or trying to grasp Hans-Georg Gadamer, we feel that we have come into contact with the truth when we have that experience of getting it, a light going on more or less involuntarily. And again, we may or may not be totally comfortable with the way Gadamer talks about there, but for my money at least, that experience of that light going on, if that's not an experience of truth, I don't know what is. Okay, I'm going to conclude this lecture there on page 113 of our reading. We haven't gotten very far. The next topic that Gadamer is going to discuss, another ancient one and a really, really big deal, and one that you guys know I have a theoretical interest in, is the topic of mimesis. And so in the next lecture, I'll talk about that. Okay, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys are all doing well. Bye-bye.